Under the veil of night, when the world had fallen silent, a lone figure remained. A mother. She stood when no one else dared to stand beside the bodies of her sons. They hung lifeless, the wind whispering through the trees. And though the world had turned its face away, she stayed. The stars watched, the earth mourned. And somewhere between heaven and the dust, a mother's heart broke, but did not give up. Everyone else had moved on. The system had failed her. The nation had forgotten. But Rizpah, she refused to let the story end in shame. No one in Scripture records her words. She never preached, never protested, never shouted at heaven. Yet her silence thundered across eternity. Because sometimes the loudest faith is the one that refuses to walk away. She had no sword, no army, no throne, but she had love holy, unyielding, unstoppable love, the kind that keeps vigil in the dark, the kind that still believes God sees what others abandon. Her name was Rizpah, and her story begins in the stillness of grief, a mother alone in the night, guarding what was left of her heart. Maybe you've been there too. Maybe you've watched something die, a dream, a relationship, a season of life, and wondered if God still remembers your name. If that's you, listen closely, because the story of Rizpah is not about death. It's about the love that refuses to die. If this opening already touched something inside you, if you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or left alone in your pain, type in the comments, "God, stay with me in the night." Share this with someone who's standing guard over their own heartbreak right now, because sometimes one act of faith in the dark can light the fire that changes everything. And stay with us, for the next part of this story will show how one mother's silent grief moved the heart of a king and the heart of God himself. Before her grief became a story the world could not forget, Rizpah lived behind the golden doors of a king's palace. The world outside saw wealth, status, and favor, but inside those walls, her heart carried a quiet ache. She was not a queen, not a wife. She was a concubine of Saul, the first king of Israel. Her name was recorded once, almost hidden in the folds of Scripture. And Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah. 2 Samuel 3-7. In those few words lay a lifetime of silence. For in ancient Israel, a concubine belonged to the king, not by covenant, not by love, but by circumstance. Chosen perhaps for her beauty, her lineage, or a political tie, but never for the right to be seen as equal. She lived under the same roof as royalty, but never sat beside the throne. Her world was made of gold and fear, gold on the walls, fear in the air. Every word spoken had to be measured. Every glance could be misread. She learned to walk softly, to smile when she wanted to cry, to bow when her heart wanted to pray. And yet, even in that constrained life, grace visited her quietly. Rizpah bore 2 sons, Armoni and Mephibosheth, children who brought laughter into cold marble halls. To others, they were royal heirs of little importance. To her, they were miracles. When she held them, she could almost forget the chains of her title. For a mother's arms, even in the house of a king, can still be a sanctuary. But shadows were gathering. The man she served, King Saul, had once stood tall in the favor of God. Israel's first chosen king, anointed by Samuel, a man whose very presence once made nations tremble. But over time, pride took root. Disobedience whispered in his soul, and he turned from the word that had crowned him. Because thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, he hath also rejected thee from being king. That one sentence became the fracture of a kingdom. The palace walls began to crack, not in stone, but in spirit. Jealousy consumed Saul like a fever. His eyes, once fixed on heaven, now burned with envy toward David, the shepherd who had slain a giant and won the people's hearts. Rizpah saw the change. She noticed the long nights when the king sat alone, tormented by the haunting sounds of his own mind. Servants whispered of madness, of an evil spirit sent to trouble him. Musicians were brought in to soothe his soul, but no melody could quiet the noise within. For Rizpah, each day became a test of faith. Would the king's wrath fall upon her sons? Would tomorrow bring peace or punishment? The palace that once symbolized safety had become a labyrinth of shifting loyalties. Still, she prayed in silence. She prayed for Saul, for Israel, for her children, and perhaps for herself, that God would see her even when men did not. There were moments, brief and holy, when she would hold her boys and whisper ancient words of trust. That the Lord watches the lowly, that he remembers the forgotten. She taught them to fear God, even when the king forgot to. She taught them that honor does not come from thrones, but from obedience. And yet, in the quiet of her heart, Rizpah must have felt the coming storm. The way the soldiers spoke David's name in hushed tones, the way the prophets no longer visited the palace, the way Saul's crown seemed heavier each day. She could feel the Spirit of God moving away from these walls, and she knew when the Spirit leaves, no fortress can stand for long. She did not know when or how, but something in her soul trembled with warning. The fall of a kingdom would soon become the fall of her home. And when that day came, the woman who had once lived among the kings would be left standing in the dust, holding nothing but love. And love would be enough. The whispers of rebellion had become a storm. The palace where Rizpah once whispered lullabies to her sons was now filled with the echo of clashing swords and the dread of a kingdom collapsing under its own disobedience. King Saul, once anointed by the hand of the prophet Samuel, had drifted far from the heart of God. Pride, jealousy, and fear had consumed him like fire in dry grass. He sought wisdom from voices that were not holy, and counsel from those who feared men more than they feared the Lord. The Spirit of God had departed from him, and without that presence, even a crown means nothing. David, the shepherd boy he once loved and later despised, had risen by God's hand. His courage against Goliath had stirred the hearts of the nation. His songs had once calmed Saul's tormented spirit, but now those same songs haunted him, reminding him of what he had lost. War came swiftly. The Philistines gathered against Israel, and the battle was set at Mount Gilboa. The sky turned gray with dust and cries of battle. Arrows flew like rain. The ground shook beneath the weight of history. On that hill, Saul and his sons fell. The sword that had defended Israel now turned against itself. The mighty king, the one the people had once begged for, died upon his own blade, his armor heavy with regret. The throne of Israel stood empty. The royal banner lay torn in the wind. And far away, in the quiet chambers of the palace, Rizpah would have felt it, the tremor of destiny the moment the world she knew ended. Her sons, Armoni and Mephibosheth, still lived, but their safety died with Saul. The crown that had once sheltered them now became the very reason they were hunted. When the dust of battle settled, David ascended the throne. It should have been a time of celebration, but peace is fragile when built on the bones of the fallen. The kingdom carried Saul's sins like a shadow, and soon judgment came in the form of famine. For 3 long years, the land grew dry, and the people groaned under the weight of hunger. No harvest, no rain, no mercy. So David sought the face of the Lord, and God answered, "It is because of Saul and his blood-stained house. He put the Gibeonites to death." The Gibeonites, wronged and forgotten, demanded justice, and justice, in that day, came in the form of blood. They asked for 7 sons of Saul, 7 heirs from the fallen king's line, to pay the price for the innocent lives taken. David hesitated. He had been the enemy of Saul once, but now he bore the weight of kingship, and kings must answer for the sins of those before them. He could not touch Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, for the covenant of friendship still bound him to mercy. But the others, 7 sons of the royal line, were chosen. Among them, 2 names that tore through the heart of a mother, Armoni and Mephibosheth, the sons of Rizpah. Imagine the silence in that moment. No prophet spoke. No angel intervened. The command had been given. Justice, they called it. But for a mother, it was a crucifixion of hope. Rizpah had no voice in the court. She had no army to defend her sons, no influence to plead for mercy. She was a woman of the past, a shadow in the palace, forgotten in the new kingdom of David. And yet, when the soldiers came for her boys, something sacred rose within her, a love fierce enough to defy kings and curses alike. She watched them taken away, their faces still young, their eyes searching for hers. And in that instant, the world stood still. Armoni, Mephibosheth, two sons born into privilege, now condemned by history. Their mother stood helpless, her prayers trembling in the air, and heaven seemed silent. But faith often begins where heaven feels quiet. Rizpah could not stop what was coming. She could not rewrite the decree. But deep inside, she resolved that if her sons must die, their memory would not, their dignity would not. The wind carried away the sounds of the soldiers' march, and the mother who once lived in the palace of a king would now walk toward the hill of execution, a place that would become sacred ground. For there, love would meet loss, and silence would speak louder than 1,000 cries. They were gone, the sons she had carried beneath her heart, the ones she had nursed, prayed over, and watched grow into men, were taken from her arms and given to the Gibeonites. The hill of Gibeah became their gallows. 7 men in total, sons of the fallen king, hung beneath the sky, their bodies swaying in the dry wind of judgment. There were no soldiers left to guard them, no priests to offer prayers, no one to bury them. The nation moved on. The law had been satisfied. Justice, they said, was done. But Rizpah could not move on. In Israel, to leave a body unburied was to curse it. It was the final mark of shame, to be exposed to the elements, to the vultures by day and the jackals by night. It was as if the world declared, these lives no longer matter. Yet to Rizpah, they mattered more than ever. When the crowds dispersed and silence fell upon the hill, a single figure returned. A mother. Her steps were slow, trembling, each one heavy with the weight of grief and defiance. She came carrying only a piece of sackcloth, rough, torn, meant for mourning, and spread it upon a rock near the place where her sons hung. That rock became her altar. That hillside, her sanctuary. The sun rose and burned her skin. The wind tore at her hair, but she stayed. At night, she drove away wild animals with stones and sticks. By day, she waved her arms to chase off the vultures. The air reeked of death. The ground beneath her was hard, but her heart was harder still. The Bible says, Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it out for herself on a rock, from the beginning of the harvest until the rain poured down from the heavens on the bodies. She did not let the birds of the air touch them by day, nor the wild animals by night. That means months, 5 or 6 months, from the start of the barley harvest until the first autumn rains. Every morning, she woke to the sound of wings and distant thunder. Every night, she sat beneath the stars, listening to the quiet, her tears mixing with the dust. People began to whisper about the woman on the hill. Some said she had lost her mind. Others said she was cursed. But heaven called her faithful, because this was not madness. It was worship. It was a mother's silent protest against shame, an act of defiant love in a world that had forgotten mercy. Her vigil was not loud. No speeches, no demands. Just the sound of cloth flapping in the wind and the rhythm of her heart refusing to stop beating. Sometimes faith doesn't shout. Sometimes it simply stays. Stays when it hurts. Stays when it's hopeless. Stays when everyone else has walked away. In the stillness of her vigil, something eternal began to stir. Her story was reaching beyond the hill, into the conscience of a nation. The soldiers who once mocked her began to fall silent. The travelers who passed by would stop and stare, unable to explain the sight of a mother standing guard over death. Perhaps they began to wonder, what kind of love refuses to let go? What kind of faith endures through rot and ruin? The wind carried her silent devotion down into the valleys, across the plains, and into the courts of the king. But before the king heard her name, God already had. He saw her sitting upon that rock, her hands blistered, her eyes swollen from weeping. He saw the birds she chased away, the darkness she endured, the love that refused to surrender to despair. Heaven watched as earth ignored her. And somewhere beyond the stars, a father who once watched his own son die knew the pain she carried. There was no choir, no audience, no comfort, only one woman, one God, and one unbreakable act of love. And as the months dragged on, something holy began to bloom amid the decay. Rizpah's vigil was transforming from a tragedy into a testimony. Her silent faith was kindling a fire in the heart of a nation that had grown cold. Soon, word would reach the palace. Soon, her silence would move a king. But for now, the world still turned as she sat upon her rock, guarding the remains of what once was, believing in the God who still is. Because sometimes, the greatest sermons are not spoken at all. They are lived in silence, in pain, in steadfast love. And Rizpah's sermon was only beginning. The days had turned into weeks. The weeks had turned into months. And still, she stayed. The woman on the hill had become a mystery, a haunting presence that no one could explain, a question that refused to go away. Travelers who passed by would slow their steps, their eyes drawn to the lonely figure sitting upon a rock, her face weathered by sun and wind, her hands raw from driving away the birds. Children whispered about her in fear and awe. Soldiers spoke her name in hushed tones. The air around her seemed sacred, like the ground itself knew that something holy was happening there. And then the whispers reached the king. David, now seated upon the throne of Israel, heard the reports from his messengers. There is a woman, my lord, a mother, who has kept watch for months over the bodies of the sons of Saul. The words pierced him like an arrow. The name Rizpah was one he remembered faintly, a name buried beneath years of war and politics. But when he heard what she had done, he could not move. He sat in silence. The image formed in his mind, a mother sitting alone among the dead, guarding what the world had thrown away. Her sorrow stood taller than any monument, her faith louder than any choir. For a long time, David said nothing. Perhaps his thoughts returned to another mother, his own, or perhaps he remembered his own guilt, the blood he had seen, the loss he had caused. But one thing was clear: this woman's love had done what no army, no prophet, no king had accomplished. It had awakened his heart. Justice had been served, but mercy had been forgotten. And now, through Rizpah's silence, God was reminding the king that both must stand together. David rose from his throne. He gave an order that would change everything. Bring me the bones of Saul and Jonathan, and gather also the remains of those who were executed by the Gibeonites. They will not be left unburied. They will be honored. And for the first time in months, the hill grew quiet. The bodies of the 7 men, including the sons of Rizpah, were taken down with care, no longer cursed, no longer forgotten. Their bones were gathered with the royal dead. So David brought up the bones of Saul and Jonathan his son, and they gathered the bones of those who had been executed. Then they buried them in the tomb of Kish, Saul's father, and after that, God answered prayer for the land. When the burial was complete, the heavens opened. Rain began to fall, gentle at first, then heavy, cleansing, redemptive. For 6 long months, Rizpah had sat beneath a sky of silence. Now, the sound of rain became her reward, God's tears mingling with her own. The famine was lifted. The curse was broken. David watched the rain fall across the hills of Gibeah, and he wept, not as a king, but as a man. He realized that true authority is not proven in battle, but in compassion, and that sometimes it takes the faith of a forgotten woman to remind the mighty what the heart of God really looks like. Rizpah's vigil had moved a king. Her love had changed a nation. But even greater than that, her faith had reached heaven. Because when God looked down from his throne, he saw in her something he recognized, a reflection of himself, a mother standing between death and dignity, between judgment and mercy, just as one day his own son would stand between sin and grace. Her silent protest became a holy echo of the cross. No words, no sword, only love that would not leave. And as the rain fell, as the bodies were laid to rest, the story of Rizpah became more than history. It became prophecy. For centuries later, another parent would watch his son die, his body hanging upon a hill, abandoned by men, but not by love. And just as Rizpah's vigil brought the end of famine, the cross would bring the end of spiritual drought. Her tears watered the soil of mercy, so that one day grace could bloom for us all. The rain had fallen, the famine was over, and the land breathed again. But the story did not end with Saul's bones or David's tears. It ended with a mother alone on a hillside, whose silence had rewritten the heart of a nation. Rizpah had not fought a war. She had not spoken before kings. She had not called down fire from heaven. And yet, through her, heaven had moved. Her vigil was over, but her faith still lingered in the wind that swept across Gibeah. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the rhythm of her breath in the breeze, a whisper between heaven and earth saying, "Love remembers." The scriptures never tell us what became of her afterward. No record of where she went, no details of how she died. The story fades quietly, as if the Bible itself bowed its head in reverence. But the silence of Scripture does not mean the absence of meaning. For sometimes, the greatest legacies are not written in ink, but in tears. Rizpah's name, it means glowing coal, and that is exactly what she became. A single spark in the darkness, burning through the cold indifference of a nation, rekindling compassion in the heart of a king, and restoring honor to the forgotten. She stood between death and dignity, just as Christ would one day stand between guilt and grace. She bore her sorrow like a cross, and through it, God showed the world that even in suffering, love can still redeem what shame has destroyed. Her story is not about death, it's about endurance. Not about punishment, but about purpose. It is about the God who sees the unseen, who hears the unheard, and who remembers the forgotten. And maybe that's why her story still matters. Because Rizpah's vigil is our vigil. It's the posture of every soul who has ever waited in silence for God to move. Every parent who has prayed through sleepless nights. Every believer who has stood guard over hope when the world said, "Let it go." Oh, her faith teaches us that grace is not always loud. Sometimes it sits on a rock in the middle of grief and simply refuses to move. Maybe you've been there too, guarding the remains of something that once lived. A dream, a friendship, a promise, something you thought God had forgotten. But Rizpah's story whispers through time. He has not forgotten. Your vigil is not in vain. The same God who saw her in the dust sees you in your darkness, and when the time is right, he will send the rain. The story of Rizpah is a sermon in silence. Through her, we see the reflection of divine love, a love that does not demand attention, a love that simply endures until redemption comes. Her vigil teaches us that mercy begins where pride ends. When the world turned away, she turned toward God. When others saw shame, she saw sacred ground. And when the heavens seemed quiet, she stayed long enough to hear the whisper of grace. God used her pain to awaken compassion in a king, and through her steadfast love, he healed a broken nation. In the same way, Christ stood watch over humanity. He refused to leave us in our curse. He entered our grief, stood between our guilt and the Father's justice, and by his endurance, the famine of our souls was lifted. Rizpah's story reminds us, God does not forget the ones who wait. He does not ignore those who remain faithful when all seems lost. Your tears are not wasted. Your silence is not empty. Your vigil is not unseen. Because sometimes the greatest miracles begin with one soul who refuses to let love die. Her name meant glowing coal, and so does yours. Because when you love through pain, when you stay when others flee, you too become a light in the darkness. If this story spoke to your heart, if you've ever waited in silence, wondering if God still sees you, take this moment to make it your prayer. Type in the comments, Lord, send the rain. I will wait until you move. Share this story with someone standing in their own vigil, someone guarding the memory of what was, hoping for what could be. And remember this, grace still moves through the quiet ones, through mothers who pray, through fathers who stay, through believers who refuse to give up when hope seems gone. Because faith is not proven in victory, it is proven in waiting. If you believe that God can still bring honor out of heartbreak, type it below and subscribe to Bible in Motion, where every story moves your faith forward, one heartbeat, one whisper, one glowing coal at a time.